Putin will say it's a success. We'll all know it was a failure, a humiliating failure, and Ukraine will get EU and NATO membership. It must do, but it's not going to get EU or NATO membership unless some of the naysayers, the potential problematic countries, Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia, maybe others, maybe Austria, get knocked into line. And that's what people need to be thinking about right now. So look, don't get me wrong, this will be messy. But what we cannot afford to do is come to an agreement with Putin which lets him take 3 years off to rebuild his armed forces and then kick off again. Because if he does that, then the Baltics are in danger, Moldova, Georgia, all these places are in danger. We cannot allow that to happen.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Willesee-Willsey, a visiting professor of war studies at King's College London and a former British diplomat. Tim, welcome to Frontline.
Good to be with you.
Wanted to start off by getting your reaction to events overnight in the US, where Kamala Harris, the Vice President, and former President Donald Trump have been clashing in the first and, at the moment, appears to be the only US presidential debate of this election. Foreign policy did play quite a key part. What was your analysis of what we saw?
Well, it was bizarre. We expected it to be bizarre, and of course it was bizarre. Any debate with Trump always is. But obviously, I was most interested in the Ukraine aspects, and it was quite clear that both of them, but particularly Trump, was clearly speaking with the election in mind. So yet again, he came up with this improbable notion that he will solve the Ukraine war between being elected and taking up office. So that's sort of between November and January, which of course is nonsense because he won't be president until January. So to an extent, we can discount quite a bit of what he says. When Boris Johnson saw Trump a couple of months ago, he emerged from the meeting saying he thought that Trump would actually be much more responsible on Ukraine than he's saying. But I think everybody, Putin, Zelensky, everybody is worrying about the election. And I think it's really having a deep effect on the situation on the ground. For example, I don't think the Kursk offensive would have happened had it not been for the forthcoming election. So Zelensky is preparing for the possibility, and it's only a possibility, that the winter period, the winter break, November 24 to April 25, might actually see a peace negotiation. So, they're scrambling for advantage. Ditto, Putin would like to take Pokrovsk before November. So this is what we're seeing on the ground. And now, I think most people who hope that Kamala Harris wins think, well, if Kamala Harris wins, it will be business as usual. I'm not actually convinced about that. I think there is a half-hearted nature about the US support for this war. That sounds, in many ways, it sounds very ungrateful. They've given vast amounts of money and vast amounts of support. We must bear that in mind. But there are aspects of the war where Biden, is not completely full-throated in his support. So there's the question, obviously, of using the missiles on Russian territory. I think and suspect that on Friday this week that will be resolved, and that there will be an announcement saying that they can, and that, of course, will be a response to the Iranian provision of 200 ballistic missiles to Russia. So in many ways, that is good news. But I think if you look right back to February 2022, the United States has been a little bit slow in provision of stuff. Too little, too late, often. And the one that worries me most of all these things, and I hope we can talk about a bit more, is the question of NATO membership for Ukraine. So if you look back and think to yourself, well, how can Ukraine win this war? It seems to me there are only two things that can happen. Ukraine can either retake territory, so it can retake Donbass and retake Crimea. And quite honestly, I think that is vanishingly unlikely. They gave it a good shot with the counteroffensive in 2023. It wasn't successful. They've done some very, very good operations in Ukraine, don't get me wrong, and they've fought valiantly in the Donbass. But yard by yard, meter by meter, Russia is making advances in the Donbass. And Ukraine realistically is not going to get the Donbass or Ukraine back, unless, of course, something dramatic happens, like the Russian army mutinies. But you cannot base a policy on the hope that the Russian army mutinies. It might not. It probably won't. But they suffer tremendous casualties, and the conditions are appalling. But nonetheless, if you look back at Russia's history, Russian armies tend not to mutiny, although they have done. The other way Ukraine can claim a win is by getting EU and NATO membership. Now, a situation at the end of the war in which they neither get their territory back nor get EU and NATO membership would be an absolute catastrophe. And I think that is what we all need to turn our minds to now. The end game. And I'm not saying we take our foot off the pedal. I'm not saying that we reduce the war effort. Obviously, we must keep up the war effort. But we must start doing some basic work on A, what happens if Trump wins, and B, how are we going to deal with a NATO application if Hungary and maybe even Slovakia oppose it? And, it means that the EU and NATO are going to have to grip some of these really difficult problems. Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia. And, I'm not seeing any evidence of sort of, if you like, work off the ball, to resolve any of these issues. Add to that other areas where Russia can make real gains. Now, the two that really worry me are Georgia, where there's a election coming up in October, but already, there's every sign that Russia is making gains in Georgia, thanks to the oligarch Ivanishvili, who is making great headway. So even though 80% or 79%, I think it is, of Georgians want to join the EU, gradually the Russians are tightening their grip on Georgia. And the other one is Moldova. Again, there are important elections in Moldova in October. There's every sign that Russia's up to its usual hybrid warfare techniques, fake information, all the usual stuff in Moldova. And I'm not seeing enough sign that the West is taking Georgia and Moldova seriously enough. And it all speaks to this general thing that for Putin, the Ukraine war is number one, number two, number three, number four priorities. And for the West, it's sort of somewhere around number seven, after the economy, after health provision, after education, after cost of living. We do not invest the same degree of focus and attention in Ukraine as Russia does. And I think that's very concerning.
I want to return, Tim, to the issue of potential future peace talks in a moment. Just on this idea of Trump-proofing Western support for Ukraine, it was notable in the debate last night. Donald Trump was pressed twice by the moderators, do you want Ukraine to win? And all he would say is, I want peace. So he wouldn't specifically say that he was on the side of Ukraine. We have got a meeting today in Ukraine between Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, and David Lammy, the new UK Foreign Secretary, in which it's expected they will agree the British Storm Shadow missiles can be used in Russian territory. That would be quite a significant moment. But what else would you like to see happen between now and November to Trump-proof Western support for Ukraine?
Well, one of the things, and this comes back to this question of contingency planning. So in Afghanistan, if you remember, Trump came to an agreement with the Taliban, a ridiculously bad agreement, with the Taliban, which basically sold out the Afghan government behind the backs of the Afghan government as well to the Taliban. Biden then came into power, briefly thought about whether he would continue to support the Afghan government, decided, probably rightly, that actually too many troops had been withdrawn. It would be too difficult to put the whole mess back together again. And so went along with the Doha Agreement. And we saw the American pullout, and it was an absolute shambles, of course, as we now know. Now, the interesting thing, why I mention Afghanistan, is Europe just watched and listened and didn't put up a fight. I mean, it is quite extraordinary that we lost 456 soldiers in Afghanistan. And I find it quite extraordinary that we just went along with the Biden decision. There weren't big delegations going to Washington saying, "Hang on, this is the wrong decision. What's this going to mean for women's rights? What are we going to do about refugees?" None of that happened. Now, is the same thing going to happen again? Is Trump going to win the presidential election and phone Putin and say, "I'm now talking to my friend Putin," and is Europe just going to sort of slope shoulders and say, "Well, that's the way of the world, that's the way it's going"? I don't think Europe can afford to do that because the war in Ukraine is in Europe. Ukraine is so close to places that really matter to us: Poland, Romania, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. All these places are right on the front line. So Europe cannot do the same thing. So my question is, what is the contingency plan if Trump wins? Is there a plan? I bet there isn't. To say, look, get on the plane, go to Washington, say to Trump, look, this is what we undertake to do. Now, what we would have to undertake to do as Europe, and I mean UK and Europe as well, what we would have to undertake to do is to gradually take over the majority of the support to Ukraine. Now, as we all know, pretty much all European militaries, with a few exceptions like Poland and Greece, are hollowed out. They're very, very short of ammunition. We don't have heavy lift air transport capability. There are all sorts of things we would still have to beg and borrow off the Americans. But ultimately, we would have to put our hands up and say, look, we will take on the bulk of the support to Ukraine. That's not to say that Trump can't start a negotiating process, which we, Europe, has got to be involved in. We can't just leave it to the Americans. We've got to be involved in that. But in the meanwhile, we would have to say to Trump, look, we will take on a lot of the burden. If you look back at Trump's first term, he didn't leave NATO, but what he did do, and actually it was quite positive, and Obama had done the same before, by the way, saying, look, Europe, you are not stepping up to the plate. You are not doing enough on your own defence. And I think there was something very ironic happened. I don't know if you noticed. So you remember there was that whole debate in Congress about whether the 61 billion package would get through, and for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, it didn't even seem likely that it would. And then suddenly in April, it was released. In the weeks before April, Europe actually started to do some serious thinking about supporting Ukraine. I mean, there was a Czech proposal to assemble 155mm ammunition from all over the world. Get it from Africa, Asia, wherever. Very, very good proposal. So people started to think very seriously. Once that 61 billion went through, everyone took their foot off the gas and said, "Oh well, it's fine. The Americans have stepped up again," and so we went back into a sort of European complacency. Now, two really serious things have happened since then, which I think are of great concern. One is the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, made significant progress in Thuringia regional elections and in Saxony. And Olaf Scholz is now really worried that the far right is benefiting from dislike of the war in Ukraine. So he is now worrying. He's now thinking, already he turned down supplying the Taurus missile to Ukraine. Now he's almost certainly going to reduce the amount of support to Ukraine. That's one thing that happened. The other one, of course, was the French parliamentary elections, where we saw the far left and the far right both do very well. And neither of them are naturally in favour of the war in Ukraine. So suddenly Germany and France, the two most important countries in the EU, are now pretty shaky on the whole Ukraine deal, which incidentally puts a lot of focus back on UK. I'm going to be very, very interested to see whether David Lammy and John Healey follow in the footsteps of Ben Wallace, who played a bit of a blinder actually on Ukraine, in that he was quite forward-leaning, and I think his risk-taking in providing munitions to Ukraine at a time when the United States was quite hesitant actually helped influence the United States in in the right direction. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether Lamy and Healy and, of course, Keir Starmer adopt the same line. I think it's extremely important they do, in view of the fact that Macron and Scholz now are, going to be less dependable on this issue. And another reason why this is important, Northern Europe really looks to UK for a lead on this. I mean, the three Baltic states, Poland, really look to UK lead because, a lot of the southern European states, Austria, Italy, are less convinced that supporting Ukraine is necessarily the right policy direction. So we're really entering an incredibly important part of this whole war now. So while so much of the focus is on particular types of missiles and Kursk incursion and stuff, I think my own feeling now is we should all start to think now of preparation for the diplomatic endgame.
It's a really interesting point you raised, Tim, about the way Europe often seems to veer between complacency and panic when it comes to Ukraine. And you're right to mention the rise of the AfD and the National Rally, and even to a lesser extent in the UK, some of the things Nigel Farage of Reform UK said in the lead up to the British general election shows that there is some Ukraine skeptic sentiment out there. But I often think that a lot of these Western leaders look at it from the wrong perspective and they see, it is inevitable. The longer any war goes on, the more there'll be public dissatisfaction with it. Surely if, for example, Olaf Scholz had provided Taurus missiles to Ukraine several months ago, that would be helping Ukraine to be in a stronger position, and that would actually change the public perception of the winnability of this war.
I think that's exactly the point. And I think that was the view that Ben Wallace took. And to Britain's credit, actually, we've been probably the least sceptical, one of the least sceptical countries on this whole thing, and been probably the firmest in our support of Ukraine. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the tanks took forever to come in 2023. The F-16s took forever to come in 2024. Obviously, there are serious issues to do with training of pilots, provision of things. But, there was also, we have to all admit, a degree of foot dragging. And it's taken a long time to get each of these big issues, whether it was tanks or fighter jets, over the line. And of course, Biden has been one of the people who's been probably more cautious. Now, let's be fair to Biden and let's be fair to the United States. They are the world's superpower, and they are the ones, who are essentially entrusted with ensuring that this war doesn't get out of control and go nuclear, for example. And I think I'm right in saying I think he's done well from that point of view. I mean, I don't know quite what the discussions with China have been, but it seems that China has been a restraining force on Putin. Because if you remember, Putin regularly used to threaten use of a nuclear weapon. And that hasn't happened now for several months. It'll be very interesting to see when the announcement is made, if it is made, over Storm Shadow and Scalp, and I think it will be Scalp as well, probably on Friday, what Putin's reaction will be. Because in many ways, he's only got himself to blame. I mean, it's really convenient that we can link this policy change to the Iranian provision of ballistic missiles. Because really, he cannot complain. If you're accepting 200 ballistic missiles from Iran, you cannot complain if the West changes its policy. And it's going to be very, very interesting to see whether he uses the nuclear word again. My sense is he probably won't. I think in a sense he's being restrained. So look, I understand Biden's caution. Don't get me wrong, but I think I think in many ways it's been excessive, and it's been very interesting how, as each red line has been crossed, nothing has happened. Now, we've got to be really careful with this. That doesn't mean that every red line is crossed, nothing will happen. So, that's a thought we need to bear in mind.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, a lot of people have speculated that one of the objectives of the Kursk incursion was for Ukraine to show its Western allies, look, we can physically invade Russian territory and still he won't reach for the nuclear button. So maybe those fears are overstated. Just on the peace talks, Tim, do you think they still happen if Harris wins in November?
Yes, I do, actually. Much slower pace. I don't think she'll be picking up the phone to Putin. But, let's face it, at some stage this war's got to come to an end. And let's face another reality, which is that in meat grinder warfare, like the warfare that's going on in the Donbass, Ukraine cannot go toe to toe with Russia on this. It just do not have enough troops and enough equipment. People are claiming that Russia's losing 1,100 soldiers a day. I mean, I don't know. I mean, statistics in war are nearly always exaggerated. But even if it's only half of that, if it was 500 a day, it's a vast number, an absolute vast number. Now, Ukraine being on the defensive, not on the attack, will be losing far fewer than that. But they can't afford to lose too many. And we've got this problem in Ukraine where so many of the soldiers in the front line are still the first generation soldiers into the fight. So they're the guys who joined up in February 2022 and are still there. And, reckon that they should have been relieved now by new recruits. And as we all know, Ukraine is finding it difficult to find new recruits. And that's quite a contentious domestic issue in Ukraine. So it's not just a question of ammunition, although that's really important, infantry ammunition, but particularly 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. It's also a matter of the willingness to fight. And I think Ukraine has done brilliantly in 2024. It survived 2024. I think 2025 will be a hell of a challenge for Ukraine. And I therefore I wouldn't be at all surprised if during 2025 we see serious negotiations begin.
What is your sense of what could be, in the end, whether it's later this year, whether it's next year, whether it's beyond, an acceptable settlement for Kyiv?
I think there's only actually one settlement, really, which is this, and this is not going to please probably most people. But I think Kyiv is going to lose Crimea and most of the Donbass. So it's going to lose 18% of its territory. That's a hell of a proportion for any country to lose. Having said that, the Donbass is completely trashed. I mean, completely trashed. I mean, it's going to be a huge amount of money to rebuild the cities there. Maybe Russia could spend that money rather than Ukraine. A lot of the people there, as you know, are Russian speaking anyway. A lot of the inhabitants have fled to Ukraine. So look, this is a really, really bitter pill to swallow. Don't get me wrong. I really don't like it. I don't even like saying it. But I don't think Ukraine is going to win back Donbass or Ukraine. Ukraine is going to win back Donbass or Crimea. So that's what Russia gets. The other thing is Russia is not going to sign up to reparations, and Russia's not going to sign up to war crimes trials. So Russia's going to get a lot. So what is the lot that we're going to give Ukraine for signing? And it seems to me it's got to be EU membership and NATO membership, and not this shilly-shallying we've done. Yes, okay, you can now get on the candidate pathway, which in 10 years might get you membership, which is where they are now. This is EU membership and NATO membership now. Now, Putin won't accept that. Of course he won't accept that. But he'll be able to go to his population and say, look, I started this special military operation because I wanted the Donbass and Crimea. Actually, we all know he wanted the whole of Ukraine, but this will be his line. I wanted the Crimea and the Donbass, and I got it, so it's a success. So Putin will say it's a success. We'll all know it was a failure, a humiliating failure, and Ukraine will get EU and NATO membership. It must do, but it's not going to get EU or NATO membership unless some of the naysayers, the potential problematic countries, Turkey, Hungary, Slovakia, maybe others, maybe Austria, get knocked into line. And that's what people need to be thinking about right now. So look, don't get me wrong, this will be messy. But what we cannot afford to do is come to an agreement with Putin, which lets him take 3 years off to rebuild his armed forces and then kick off again. Because if he does that, then the Baltics are in danger. Moldova, Georgia, all these places are in danger. We cannot allow that to happen. So the only way we can ensure it doesn't happen is by giving Ukraine NATO protection. under Article 5. So all in if one of our members is attacked. Now, Biden has been reluctant to do it. I don't think he's wanted to do it. I somehow doubt that Trump will want to do it. But this is what, if there is a plan, as there should be, for European prime ministers or even prime ministers to get on a plane to Washington, over December this year, January next year, and go and speak to Trump if he wins. That surely has got to be what the game plan is.
Tim Willesee, really appreciate your insight and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.